last time I was here with the time change. Okay, so welcome. I'd lost track of what number class this is, but we're working our way through Letter to a Friend. Welcome, everyone. So Mary Lutz is not able to be here tonight, so I'm going to share the prayers, and Jana, if you would lead us in those, that would be great. Okay, good.
Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. We'll do 3 times in English. To the
Founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge.
Short mandala offering, once in English. This ground
anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami.
Refuge in bodhicitta, once in English, twice in Tibetan. I go for
Refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Changchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyen Gi Peso Nam Gi Drola Penshir Sangye Drupar Sho Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Changchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyen Gi Peso Nam Gi Drola Penshir Sangye Drupal Sho. Okay, thank you, Jana. All right, let's do a short meditation before we begin the class. And we'll spend the first few minutes just focusing on the breath. Oh, need to put on the microphone here. Yeah, probably a good idea. I always have to try to figure it out again.
I think it has to go on
This way.
the left, that's, yeah.
Like I said, thank you, Jana, figuring it out for me. All right, I think we're almost amplified here in the Gompa now. So again, we'll do a few minutes of meditation on the breath, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for tonight. We got one more person joining here, so looks like Sarah. Okay, good. All right, so we'll begin the meditation now. So in the last class, we touched on the subject of emptiness. And this is important to bring into our developing motivation because it's the means by realizing emptiness for us and all beings to attain liberation and enlightenment. And when we examine this topic, it's important that we do it with a motivation that at least is intent upon that individual liberation, becoming free from our own suffering. Because these wisdom teachings are very profound, but they serve that incredible purpose, helping to remove everything that obscures our own minds, everything that is keeping us from actualizing our own potential. So we start with that level of motivation, especially as we'll be resuming this section on emptiness, to want to investigate this topic from the vantage point of our own liberation, our own freedom from samsara, from the round of existence we've been involved with since beginningless time. Just really want this for yourself as a starting point for your motivation for tonight. We should want this as well for all other beings, because we see that they're just like us. They want to be happy and don't want to suffer, but they're under the control of their karma, their delusions, in particular, this ignorance that grasps at things as being real, inherently existent, and so on. When we investigate the topic of emptiness, we should do so not just for our own benefit, but so that we can lead others to that truth, to that wisdom, help them to actualize their potential. And we can't do that perfectly until we become fully enlightened. So this is the ideal motivation to bring to these teachings, particularly on emptiness, developing this wisdom, is to see that we can benefit so many beings if we actually develop our own minds to that degree, all the way to Buddhahood, and then lead them perfectly to attaining that same state. So hold that motivation for this evening so that everything we do becomes a cause for those results. Our own liberation, moreover, our own enlightenment, and then the liberation and enlightenment of all sentient beings. Okay, so we are in the section of Letter to a Friend that's quite specifically directed at householders, lay people like ourselves. And we were in the section that had to do with dealing with our desire and other delusions, and the idea that we can, to some degree, lessen them through changing our perception of things, what have you. And then we entered into this section where we're looking at, again, they use this word, the eschewal, the elimination of our desire and afflictions through the wisdom realizing emptiness. So I'm just going to back up a little bit because it's been 2 weeks since I taught, and I also had that lousy connection. Whoops, what did I do that for? It's trying to click on it, but okay. But essentially, yeah, we had a bad connection from Vajrapani, and I want to make sure, just briefly going over this, we see that again, there are 6 divisions of this second part, which goes into how can we actually get rid of the seeds of desire. And we see that this is involving, again, the method for the total, whoops. Maybe I didn't share this yet. What am I doing here? Oh, that's being shared. Yeah, I'm just trying to get to here. Okay. I just need to get out of this thing. Somehow that got clicked on. Okay. There's again these 6 divisions that have to do with, as it says, are the method involving the total elimination of desire together with its seeds. Of course, and then all the other afflictions as well. Our anger, our jealousy, our ignorance, all of these can be eliminated, but only through this method of realizing emptiness. So we see again that on page, well, this is verse 27 again. This is the pages here are based on my own putting this together into another file, so they don't really relate to anything that you have in hand. But this is from Rendawa, Venerable Rendawa's commentary. He says the practices of meditating upon the body's impurity and so forth, as we just went through in that previous section, serve only to suppress desire temporarily. They don't eradicate it. So this next verse thus states that since one wishes to remove desire, along with its seeds entirely, one should meditate upon the path as presented below. So this is where we get introduced to this in verse 27. And most of what we're looking at is simply a commentary on this verse. And I'm not going to spend time going through all of the paragraphs that we went through, but I want to at least touch on the verse and then go forward to where we left off last time. It says in verse 27 from Nagarjuna's text, in order to see the highest meaning, exercise proper attention towards all entities. There is no other dharma so virtuous. Those words sound kind of obscure, but essentially it's saying we have to have a proper mental attention directed at everything that we see, including, of course, ourself, the I. This is because, again, we are currently under the sway of our ignorance that is falsely grasping at things as if they inherently existed. Of course, this is also how things appear. And that appearance, that false appearance, is due to imprints in our minds from having believed in that false appearance for so long. It's kind of this chicken and the egg thing. Which came first, the false appearance or the ignorance? Well, we've had both since beginningless time, so it's kind of a moot point. But the idea is that whenever things appear to us in this way, as if having their own substantial, inherent, independent existence, we believe in that. That's an improper mental attention. It's looking at things in an incorrect way, according to the way that things actually exist. So what we need, as was said in that verse, is proper attention. Having this, we're looking at things through the lens of the wisdom of emptiness. It says things don't exist in that way that they appear. They aren't set up from their own side. They don't have their own entity, like this bell ringer. As soon as I hold it up, it seems to have its own identity out here established on its own. But as again, through the teachings on dependent arising, which we're going to touch on a little bit tonight, we see that things actually have a dependent nature, not an independent nature. They don't exist on their own, established from their own side. So again, Nagarjuna, or Venerable Wendawa, has a rather lengthy commentary on this. It's a simple verse from Nagarjuna, but he goes on to talk about how this is the highest meaning. The highest meaning is the wisdom of emptiness. We can understand a lot of things conventionally, and the Buddha, most of what he taught, it seems, is actually conventional truths. Understanding karma, understanding rebirth, understanding true sufferings, understanding rebirth, understanding all these various topics that are conventionally true, but they don't exist in an ultimate mode. When we look for their ultimate existence, we find their emptiness, their lack of any inherent existence. So this is what the highest meaning is meant in that verse when it said, in order to see the highest meaning, exercise proper attention towards all entities. There's no other dharma so virtuous. This is the most virtuous mind that we can develop. You can develop a lot of conventional virtue following the teachings that we've already seen on practicing good morality, abandoning killing, and so on. But the highest meaning we can derive in the most virtuous dharma we can practice is to realize emptiness. So then let me go back to the text and just point out a few passages that'll get us back to where we were. So one may ask, it says at the top of the screen there, what is this highest meaning like? How does one meditate upon it with proper mental attention? It is the suchness. We used this word the last time again. Suchness is an equivalent to emptiness. Sometimes you have this word thusness, suchness, emptiness, selflessness. All these are negations, right? Ness, kind of well, actually not the ness part of it, the emptiness part of it, and so on. But the idea is that we have kind of a state of things existing as such, a state of things existing as such, the selflessness of things, the emptiness of things. These are, again, are the true nature of all dharmas, which is called the highest meaning. So then there was a quote from, again, I just point this out again because there was an error, it seems, in the text in terms of how this was translated. When someone asked, well, what is this emptiness, this suchness like? This is the verses from Nagarjuna in his Fundamental Wisdom, the very profound philosophical text he wrote on the middle way. It says, not ascertainable from others, quiescent, beyond description through verbal expression, and that should say non-conceptual and undifferentiated is the definition of tattva or suchness. So I'm not going to describe all of these because again, even our author, Venerable Randhawa, doesn't go into an extensive description. But essentially, emptiness is something that goes beyond words and concepts. When we can talk about it, as we'll do tonight, as we did the previous time, but getting at it through just concepts is not going to get at the actual meaning of it. We have to use that as a bridge, and eventually the conceptual mind falls away, and we know emptiness in that direct, bare way when the mind and emptiness kind of become one and undifferentiable. And so essentially, this is the nature of all phenomena, but it's not something, again, that is so evident to us. It's something we actually have to analyze in order to understand and know. So it says here, this paragraph, maybe a little bit of this, moreover, one need not search for tattva, suchness, anywhere other than in the true nature of the dharmas, the phenomena of form and so forth, form, feeling, discrimination, compositional vectors, consciousness, the five aggregates, and so on. And he says, which are subject to the law of dependent origination. This is because there's no higher object than dependent origination. And I won't go into the rest of this paragraph because, again, I explained that the last time. But the idea is that we are looking at this concept of dependent origination and emptiness as pointing essentially to the same reality, just coming at it from two different vantage points. Emptiness is the lack of any independent existence. Dependent arising or dependent origination is the existence of dependent existence. So when we see them that way, they kind of make sense, right? No independent existence, only dependent existence. And dependent existence has, again, different layers, different ways that we see it. Things arising from causes and conditions, and you go back to this little bell ringer. There's, the main substantial cause of this is the wood that it was produced from, right? The little wooden ball at the end, as well as the dowel here that you hold when you ring it, ring the chime and so on. And it also has many other causes and conditions, involved in its coming into existence. And that's to get at the point that we think things kind of stand alone, but this is actually a product of a variety of causes and conditions and cannot exist without them. And even at that level, all the great masters of the middle way essentially say that even at that level, you can still realize the most profound emptiness because you get that things cannot have any sort of discrete, independent existence. And that's what we're essentially negating. But all the lower schools, they of course say that that actually proves that things have an essential nature. Because otherwise, if you didn't have the wood having its woodness and all the various factors having their own entity, then this couldn't arise having its own bell ringerness, if you will. That things kind of have something inherent that is then lent to every product that is produced. They say no problem that the Buddha taught dependent origination and dependence upon causes and conditions. It just isn't teaching what these middle way folks say. The middle way folks say it teaches absolutely that things lack any independent or inherent existence. We're going to get into more of this as we go through tonight's continuing portions of the text. But essentially, this is the nature of everything that exists. And we have to begin to kind of see this and appreciate that because this is what needs to be realized, again, in order to cut the root of samsara, in order to attain our own liberation, as well as, of course, to attain enlightenment. So let's go on then to this next page, where I do have some additional verses that Venerable Rendao, and this is the one that we actually ended with. This one, I got to move the screen up just a little bit. This is from Ratnavali, another of Nagarjuna's texts. Nagarjuna was very prolific, wrote quite a few texts. Ratnavali is known as the Precious Garland. It's also a text that was written for a king, and it's much, much longer than the one that we're going through. It's about 500 verses, and here it says the Ratnavali states, so long as there's clinging to the real existence of the aggregates, meaning again, form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, consciousness. The first one is physical, the body, and then the other four are mental. So long as we cling to those things existing real, in reality, meaning how they appear, will there also remain the belief in a self, in an I? Remember that when we start talking about this idea of an I, or person, we are essentially talking about something that exists in a very subtle mode of dependent origination. I just touched on the coarser one. But when you talk about things, and let's go ahead and talk about the basis for a body. I'm sorry, basis for a self, which includes the body and the mind. We talk about this basis, the stuff that is sitting on the chair that you're sitting on, or whatever it is that your cushion, what have you. When you kind of begin to look at this, you see that there's first of all a dependence upon parts. We have this sense of a whole I here, right? There's a single unitary I, and it has parts. We can even talk about my body, my mind, and so on. We have this way of kind of referring to it in that language. But we see that the I has a dependence upon its parts. And of course, we could even say vice versa. We don't talk about this being my body or my mind unless there's an I that is the possessor of those and so on. But we see that, again, the I and the parts are this whole and this basis of designation, or this kind of collection of stuff that we think of as I. And this leads us into that most subtle view of dependent arising, which is in the end, there's nothing more than this thought of I in relation to this body and mind. There's no real I that we can find on this collection of stuff that we can point to and say, there I am. There is that thing that is equivalent to I. Sometimes the I does feel like it's more physical than, mental. Other times we feel like we're more in our mind than we are in our body. But these two kind of facets of our experience, mental and physical, are really just the basis for what we call I. They don't have any kind of inherent existence as the I. And there's a whole analysis that we can do where we go looking for that real I, that sense that there's something real, concrete that is the I. And we don't find it to be equivalent to the body or any part of the body. We don't find it to be equivalent to the mind or any part of the mind. And in this way, we can come to negate that it has any inherent existence that is the same as this collection of stuff. And of course, it's also not something completely independent of this body and mind either. So essentially, when we get into these teachings about kind of the way in which we can realize emptiness through dependent origination, it all comes down to, once we've established that things depend upon their causes and conditions, things depend upon their parts, and then thirdly, that things depend upon labeling those parts as whatever it is that we deem it to be through our conventional agreement. We're going to call this computer, and we're going to call that table, and we're going to call, this person and what have you. We have this conventional way of talking about things and referring to things, and things don't have any inherent nature or any real nature beyond that. And that nature is very, very subtle. It's just nominal existence. We're just kind of naming this I, we're naming that chair, we're naming this computer. It doesn't have any existence as those things. So that's the means of seeing that things lack any inherent existence. The reasoning of dependent origination, dependent arising, is said to be the kind of the ruler over all the other reasonings because it helps us to firmly establish the way that things exist conventionally, so we don't fall into some nihilistic bent and think that things don't exist at all. And moreover, it does get rid of the sense of the I or the person or whoever, whatever phenomenon, being inherently there, existing independently on its own, because things only exist in dependence upon other factors. So dependent arising in and of itself is said to be the most powerful way that we can realize emptiness. So oftentimes we see like the person who realizes dependent arising realizes emptiness. The person who realizes emptiness realizes dependent arising. These are kind of two ways of looking at the nature of things in terms of their ultimate truth and their conventional truth. Things arise in dependence upon various factors. They lack any independent existence. So let's go back to the verse, and then that's where we ended last time, was with this verse. I just wanted to again backtrack just a bit so that we have some grounding in what we're talking about tonight. So again, so long as we cling to the real existence of the aggregates, the mind and body and so on, there will also remain the belief in a self. Because once you realize the lack of inherent existence, or real existence as it's called here, in regard to one phenomenon, you realize it in regard to all phenomena, because it's the same for everything that exists. The mind, the body, the head, the feet, the fingernails. I mean, anything that we analyze in regard to those things that exist conventionally, we cannot find them to have inherent existence. Once we negate it with regard to one phenomenon, then we can negate it in regard to all. So this is especially important because we do have some analyses that get at a coarser view of the person that are used. I'm not going to go into those tonight, but essentially we have to get down to this very deep, profound truth that the I, the self, the person, as well as the body, the mind, everything that exists, lack any real existence, as it's indicated here. And it says, with the belief in a self, there occurs karma, and from that, in turn, rebirth. So this is again that idea of the nature of samsara. Samsara is arising from the roots of ignorance, which is believing in that concrete independent I. On the basis of that, we have other delusions arising, attachment to what brings pleasure to that I, an aversion towards what brings pain and displeasure to that I. And we are doing this whole little dance to try to protect that I. And that I doesn't even exist. This false sense of an I we hold to so strongly, but it doesn't have any real existence. And then on the basis of those mental states, we engage in karma. Now, most of what we're talking about is here in this section is the afflictions and the various afflicted states of mind that lead to non-virtuous karma. But even our wholesome states of mind are still rooted in ignorance. They still have a false grasping at the I as inherently existing. So we do also have to, kind of understand that that's arising within ignorance. Therefore, we experience the good things in samsara, the bad things in samsara, on the basis of a misconception that's all rooted in this belief in an I that doesn't exist in the way that we think it does. So this is what we have to uproot if we're ever going to be free of all of these afflictions. And of course, our virtues can still be there. That's what's kind of nice. I mean, we don't get rid of all of our virtuous states of mind. Our virtuous states of mind can be upheld within the wisdom of emptiness. Because even though things don't exist inherently, they still do exist conventionally. And we can still practice generosity towards merely imputed sentient beings, merely imputed things we give them through the merely imputed act of giving. But when we are dealing with the delusions, they need ignorance in order to arise. So this whole section is giving us how do we actually eliminate the afflictions by eliminating their root. How do we eliminate their root? Through coming to see emptiness. How do we see emptiness? Through seeing dependent origination, through seeing that things cannot arise in an independent manner. And that's the false conception that we're being driven by. That's the root of all of samsara. So again, I realize I went through that a bit quickly, but that was just to get us up to this part where we're going to go into several more pages, actually about 3 or 4 more pages of looking at emptiness. So kind of fasten your seatbelts because that's what we're in for tonight. I know it's a difficult topic sometimes, but maybe it'll get clear with what we have to go through. So we have here, let me move this back up to the top, I think. So I can actually get down here and move the screen a little bit better. Okay, so the paragraph at the top of the page there. With the ineffable realization, let me actually make it larger. I think it's probably too small here in the Gompa and maybe even on screen. With the ineffable realization of the above mentioned sunyata is emptiness, encompassing the dependent entities of form, feeling, and so on, all the mental afflictions and conceptualizations are eliminated and deliverance attained. Because this is how we actually attain deliverance, liberation, through realizing that shunyata, that emptiness, which encompasses, on its flip side, is the dependent nature of things. That all these things that are empty of inherent existence still exist in the mode of dependent origination, dependent arising. That's how mental afflictions and conceptualizations are eliminated. So the same scripture, meaning Ratnavali, precious garland of Nagarjuna, says, when one's determined that it, meaning samsara, does not arise from itself, does not arise from something that is, utterly inherently different, doesn't arise from both, something that is itself and different, or that it arises inherently within the 3 times, past, present, and future, the belief in a self ceases, and thereby both karma and rebirth as well. So how things come to an end, how it comes to a grinding halt, is through realizing emptiness, not through your first direct realization of emptiness, but through repeated realizations where you remove more and more of these seeds of the ignorance and so on that are within your own mind stream. So this is how we actually attain this, is through realizing emptiness. There's no other methodology. So this same suchness, now Venerable Randawa says, of dharmas described earlier is also called at times no self or anatman. I mean, atman, it's kind of interesting because we use this word self in a variety of ways. Frequently when atman is used, it's used in the Vedic tradition to refer to like a soul, an aspect of ourselves that is completely independent of the mind and body that goes on to achieve their moksha or liberation. But we can use this phrase selflessness or no self. And we can use that to refer to, again, suchness, emptiness, what have you. So then Venerable Randawa says there is no way of achieving liberation other than through realizing its meaning. Again, that highest meaning that was mentioned in the verse. That's the only way out. That's the only exit. And since this realization destroys all extreme views, it is the middle path. No one but the Buddha, not even Ishvara or Vishnu, is capable of revealing the true meaning of Anatman. And then I'll just read this and then I'll comment a little bit. This is from the 400 stanzas by Aryadeva. It says, this expresses it in the following words: the sole gateway to peace, the destroyer of all wrong views, the apprehension of all the Buddhas is called Anatman, or selflessness. So again, I already mentioned this kind of middle way where we're between the 2 extremes. Things can fall into the extreme of nihilism, thinking things don't exist at all. Or where we're at, we fall into this extreme of thinking that things exist inherently. This gets rid of that extreme by saying things don't exist independently, they exist dependently. But then if we start falling into the extreme of nihilism, we get pulled back by the fact that things still do exist. They originate, they arise. The Buddha never said things don't exist at all, or if he said it in those words, he meant don't exist inherently. Because there wouldn't be a lot of point to saying things don't exist at all. Then Buddhahood doesn't exist. The Buddha doesn't exist. Nobody exists. It would be kind of pointless. Things do exist, but again, in a very, very subtle manner. So we have to realize this shunyata, this emptiness that is this middle way, this middle path between these two extremes. That is, as Aryadeva said, the only way out. It's the sole gateway to liberation. Without realizing that, we never can know freedom from what we've been dealing with since beginningless time, being under the control of this ignorance, going from life to life. Again, in the mechanism we just talked about, through the force of that ignorance, we have other states of mind that are tainted by that ignorance. They give rise to actions, karma. That karma gives rise to our experiences in samsara. If we begin to realize emptiness through a very deep and profound state of wisdom, through developing meditative stabilization, a really focused mind, we then begin to create what's called uncontaminated karma, which is karma that leads to nirvana, our own freedom and cessation of our suffering, as well as eventually to Buddhahood, the state where we can then help others to achieve that same goal. So again, the only way to realize all of this is through the portal of the wisdom of emptiness, understanding that very profound topic, again, that is non-conceptual in its final state and is very difficult to realize. Then at the bottom of this page, we have the commentary again from Venerable Randawa. He says, further, the process for realizing this sunyata involves gaining the understanding that the nature of form and so on, those dharmas which constitute the illusory world, it's illusory, meaning like an illusion. It is not a complete illusion because it does exist, but it's like an illusion, existing in a way that is different to how it appears. So again, the nature of form and so on is such that their utter existence is totally dependent upon appropriate conditioning factors, right? And that's what the dependent arising is talking about. It's just, he keeps approaching dependent arising from a variety of different ways. He says, for any other view would constitute falling into the extreme of eternalism or that of nihilism. This is presented in a sutra in the following manner. So we have a little sutra quote. It says, that which arises from conditioning factors has not arisen, meaning not arisen inherently. Of course, things arise. That's the whole point. They do arise from various factors, dependent upon various things, but they don't arise inherently. Then the next line, it does not possess a nature of arising. Again, inherently. The Buddha didn't say inherently every time he said this, but for us, I mean, really, these two are very close, because the only way we think things exist is inherently. That's our misconception that we're dealing with. When we negate that, it seems like we're negating total existence. And when we actually establish how things exist, it's, as I said, quite subtle. Lama Zopa Rinpoche would always say, it's almost as if things don't exist. Almost, Not that they don't exist at all, but it's almost as if they don't exist. Okay, then the sutra quote continues. That which depends upon conditioning factors is called void. Another term for emptiness sometimes is voidness, which is a kind of a strange one. I don't think many people use that one anymore, but that which depends upon conditioning factors is called empty. He who knows emptiness, voidness, has acquired mindfulness. So again, just from the Buddha saying that this is also, again, how we have to come to realize this. Where did I went back somehow. I don't know how I did that. Go forward again to where we were. So again, this is just the Buddha saying that we have to see that things don't inherently arise. They don't have that nature of inherent arising. And that is because they are dependent upon conditioning, upon other causes, and so on. Then we have a little more bit from Venerable Randawa. He says, moreover, dependent origination can be understood through the reasoning known as negation of the four extremes in respect to arising. These were mentioned briefly in the previous page. I didn't go into them there. How things don't arise from themselves. They don't arise from something that's completely other than themselves, and so on. gets to be a little complicated. I'll explain it in as quick a way and brief a way as I can, but the Acharya himself has stated in the Lokati Tatstava. This is actually Nagarjuna once more being referred to here as the Acharya. He wrote a text called Hymn to the Buddha, the worldly transcendent. It's a praise of the Buddha for teaching dependent origination primarily. And in that verse 19, he says, dialecticians have variously claimed that misery, suffering, dukkha, as the Buddha called it in the Sanskrit, is produced by a cause of the same nature or one that is different, that it is produced by both the same and different, or does not have a cause. So he's pointing to these non-Buddhist dialecticians who say, oh, and there are various schools that are associated with each of these points of view, that misery or suffering arises from something that is the same nature as it, or something that is completely or is different than it, or that is produced by both, or it doesn't have a cause at all, which sounds kind of strange because we see causes and conditions operative in the world all the time. But nonetheless, I think it's the Charvakas, the hedonists, as they're referred to often, that believe things don't have causes at all. And then in praising the Buddha, Nagarjuna says, you, however, meaning the Buddha, have declared it to be dependent origination. So now this is going to be explained. So let's go further. He goes back to a verse that just preceded that by a few, talking about a sprout. And this is actually the way that we often talk about it. Talking about suffering gets to be a little complex. Let's go down to like something material that we can point to and say a sprout. Okay, a sprout does not come into being from either a seed which has utterly perished or not perished at all. In other words, it would be either the completely different or the same. You have stated that all origination is like the arising of an illusion. It's kind of illusory the way things come into existence, because a seed, we're going to come into the kind of description in the next paragraph, but if you start with a seed, I assume alfalfa has seeds, right? We know what alfalfa sprouts are because people eat them all the time, right? So you have an alfalfa seed, and eventually that seed becomes the sprout, right? The shell of it opens up enough so that the sprout begins to come out. And there's a point in time where we designate that there is a sprout there and the seed is no longer there, right? What this idea of production, no inherent production, is getting at is that when you have this process going, that can you point to the seed being utterly non-existent? In other words, it's completely different than the sprout. So that it's completely different. So that you have this thing that is a seed that is somehow still able to be established when sprout is manifest, when sprout is there. If it was completely and utterly different, then that would have to be the case, right? You would see that there would be something that is still there that is the seed, while this thing that is arising, the sprout, it coexists. But that isn't the case, right? It can't be completely and utterly inherently different, or else they would be two separate entities. Seedness would still be retained over here, sproutness over here. That's not how things arise, right? And then and don't get me wrong, the seed is different than the sprout, but only nominally different, right? Because when seed goes through that process of transformation and the little shell begins to fall off and the sprout comes out, the seed isn't utterly destroyed in terms of it's not non-existent completely, right? Because although we don't say there's a seed there, the same stuff that was in the seed is now in the sprout. So it didn't completely disappear. It's not completely gone. But nonetheless, we can say that's different, but that's different only in terms of designating it. We're going to designate it as seed over here, and we're going to designate it as sprout at this particular moment in time. And then maybe sprout, if it continues, becomes, seedling or whatever. I don't know what they would call it. I'm not a botany specialist. And then it becomes maybe a plant or, bush or whatever. I don't know what alfalfa grow on. But essentially, you would have this whole, again, everything has this process of transformation and changing. It's very illusory, right? You don't really point at it and say there's this discrete thing here that is completely gone, then and this discrete thing here that is arising, and then this discrete thing there. It's a process of transformation. And we've simply given it those labels. If a botanist was here, they'd say very clearly what the labels are for all these various phases. Remember when I first saw, like, they had those When I was growing up, they had those pictures from in the womb of the various stages of an infant's development, a fetus developing. And they give like kind of different names, like a zygote, it's called a zygote at one point. Well, who's deciding that? It doesn't have any zygoteness from its own side, right? It's merely us giving a designation to that on the basis of where it is in a process of development. But it starts off again with those two seeds that multiply, divide, what have you, and they increase to a mass that you call it that, and then it increases more and has certain parts you can identify, and we call it something else, and da 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 da. It's the same with everything that is kind of arising through production. So this idea that it doesn't arise from something that is completely different from it, because if it was completely different, then the seed would exist at the same time that the sprout exists. Now, to say that it is the same, it arises from something that is the same, well, that isn't true either, really, right? Because the seed and the sprout do have a different conventional nature. I think it's the Samkhya school that say that this is what's going on, is they say that within the seed is like a non-manifest sprout. I mean, we could say, yeah, the seed has the potential to become a sprout, but the non-manifest sprout isn't in the seed. It's only there when it manifests, right? And then we would call it a sprout. So this is the idea that there can't be something that is utterly the same as that. And we'll see some of the consequences of that. The third possibility, something again, first, completely different. Second, the identical, the same. Third, both identical and different. Well, how does that happen? How can something be both? It's to be kind of a contradictory nature in terms of the causes of something being completely different and completely the same. Then it also, of course, is going to have other ramifications to it if that were the case, because the same faults that we said for same and different are going to apply there. The fourth option, again, was that things don't arise from a cause at all. Well, do we see that in our world? Again, do sprouts just fall out of the sky, without any seed or all the other conditions that lead to a sprout, the moisture, the sunlight, the warmth, whatever? So again, these are the four possibilities if something were to exist inherently. I think the one that we tend to cling to most is that first one I mentioned, things being completely different, because we do label them different. As I said, we call that a seed at this point, we call it a sprout after this process of development has started. But they aren't completely different. It doesn't have any seedness that is inherently there, or a sproutness that is inherently there, because that belies its ability to be produced. How could this seedness change if it is an inherently existent seed into a sprout? And then the inherently existent sprout, it can't have its own kind of established sproutness, or it couldn't rise into the next stage, whatever you're going to call that next stage, and so on. Things would not be able to change if they had inherent nature. The whole process of change and our giving designations to this is all a dependent arising. It's just how we are looking at things on the basis of our conventional awareness. Things don't have an inherent reality as what they appear to be, a seed, a sprout, and so on. This is all just our mere designation, our mere reputation. Let's look at the consequences that are set out in regard to these. As for the proof of this doctrine, entities are determined not to arise from a cause of the same nature. Why? Because it would be inconsistent for an object already existing to produce itself, right? If the sprout is already there in the seed, well, then it doesn't need to be produced because it's already there. It'd be inconsistent for it to, if it already exists in the seed, for it to be produced, for the sprout to produce itself from that. Secondly, because the arising of the object would then be without any purpose, right? Because it's already there. So you don't need a purpose, to be able to, or you don't have any purpose for things being generated if they have already been generated there before. And then third, because the process of arising would result in an infinite regress, meaning that things would continue to arise again and again and again, because if they do arise, they are already there inherently within the cause. So you would have an infinite arising. It would just keep arising again and again and again. These do take some time to work with these consequences, but this is one of the main techniques that's used. Again, I realize this is pretty dense stuff, but we'll go through this section and then we'll be closer to wrapping it up. We still have another page and a half or two, I think. Yeah, a little bit over a page. Okay, these same entities are also determined, secondly, not to arise from a cause of an essentially different nature, meaning an inherently existent nature, a completely, utterly different nature. For if they did, it would follow that first, everything could arise from everything, right? If something that is completely different than the sprout gives rise to the sprout, well, then anything can be completely different from the sprout, right? It doesn't require any relationship, any causal relationship. Everything could arise from everything, you know? And secondly, incompatible entities could possess a relationship of cause and effect. A bell ringer could give rise to a sprout, you know, because everything can arise from everything. Therefore, you can have a relationship of cause and effect between any things that exist, regardless of whether they're compatible or not. Again, these are get into the more kind of thinking about the consequences of this. I think just, you know, what I explained earlier, hopefully is sufficient to get, oops, I did that again, to get some appreciation for how things are incapable of arising in this way. Okay, so then the third, entities are determined not to arise from a cause which is both of the same and a different nature. Why? Because the fallacies pertaining to each separate hypothesis would again obtain. You know, you can't, if we say things can't exist from something that is the same or can't arise from something that is the same as them, and they can't arise from something that is utterly different than them, well, then something that is both, it would have the same faults. And these faults would accrue for the same combined hypothesis as they would for each separate hypothesis. And then also because the two hypotheses are contrary, something arising from something that is the same as it and something that is utterly different than it, these are contrary. So how could you have something arising in that contrary way? Lastly, the whole idea of things existing without causes. It is further determined that entities do not arise without a cause, because first they would either be eternally existent or eternally non-existent, right? Because causes and conditions don't play a role in their coming into existence or going out of existence. So they would be eternally in that mode of being existent or non-existent. And secondly, because it would be useless to strive for a particular result or goal by means of applying oneself to those things which cause it to come about. I mean, it'd even be ridiculous to like plant, you know, seeds in your garden to have things arise because that's not they don't depend upon causes and conditions. I mean, it sounds so strange. This is where again they pointed out that various dialecticians, philosophers of these various schools of thought that existed at the time of the Buddha, who held to some of these. I mean, most of us, I don't think, have these kind of absurd views. You know, we do hold to things arising from other factors. Our big problem is, again, that one that I mentioned, that we think things have an inherent existence. And we almost even think that if they didn't have that, just like the lower schools, then you couldn't have alfalfa sprouts arising from alfalfa seeds. You couldn't have that relationship because there has to be this alfalfa inherent, you know, ness to it. It has to have that from its own side for an alfalfa sprout to come out of an alfalfa seed. Well, again, we say that no, conventionally that can still happen. It's just there's no inherently existent alfalfa seed and alfalfa sprout. If those were the case, it actually couldn't arise because the identity of that would be established already from its own side. Nothing could change. An inherently existent alfalfa seed could never become an inherently existent alfalfa sprout. And when we understand how things are still existing in this very subtle way through mere imputation, we see that we have a merely imputed alfalfa seed that is the cause for a merely imputed alfalfa sprout that is its result. And that's the only way that it all exists. And the fact that things do have something that is kind of carried through speaks to their dependent nature. It doesn't speak to their independent nature. It speaks to the fact that things arise from causes and conditions that are going through an iteration, a process of changing, becoming something other than what they started off as. And we're going to give names, labels again to things in this process. But there's no inherent production in there. There's nothing that is being produced inherently. Again, I know that this is one of the tougher analyses, and you know, the easier ones are the ones like, you know, refuting the inherently existent I through the 4-point analysis. You know, these sorts of things. They're tough too, but this one you kind of have to scratch your head a bit. And we use this analysis in Chandrakirti's text when we studied it, the middle way in Italy. And it does take some time to get your head around. But if you do kind of analyze this, really in regard to just that process, if you were able to keep an eye, I mean, I remember when we were in grade school, I think we did those little experiments where you had like something growing inside soil in a jar or something you could kind of see because of its proximity to the glass. You could see what was going on. And you just think about that whole process unfolding. Of course, if you do the time lapse photography, right, you can see it happening much quicker. So, but we look at it every day in school and it'd just be like a little bit more green, a little bit more green, and so on. But it becomes quite arbitrary, right, as to when we designate something as something else. We're calling it a seed now, and when does it stop being a seed? Well, at some point when the sprout's there, and then the seed's gone, right? But the seed's not utterly gone, again, because the seed became the sprout. The very raw stuff that is the basis for the seed becomes the raw stuff that is the basis for the sprout, just with additional mass to it and different color and what have you. So this is what happens, again, just kind of I was quite fascinated with it once I got my head around it, but it does take a little while to kind of work with this. So again, this is the reasoning of dependent arising is showing that things have this dependent nature. They depend upon causes and conditions, but not in a concrete, inherent way. They depend upon those in a very nominal way. So to summarize, since entities don't arise, sprouts and so on, through any of these four extremes, it's established that their occurrence is totally dependent upon appropriate conditioning factors. This is the meaning of dependent origination, which is the antidote for all extreme views and is called the middle way, the middle path. Again, there's a wonderful verse from Nagarjuna's Fundamental Wisdom that was quoted previously. What arises in dependence, we term emptiness. Emptiness means that conventionally designated things are contingent. They depend upon their causes and conditions, and is itself the middle path. And this is the middle way between these two extremes. By understanding things don't have an independent existence, we negate that extreme, but yet by holding them to still arise through dependence upon various factors, we don't fall into that other extreme of kind of nihilistic points of view. So then he goes on to say there's no mental outlook whatsoever higher than the realization of dependent origination, especially at this level. As I said, we ourselves, even when we hear it, we might not see the full import of it. And certainly some of the lower schools of Buddhism don't. They adhere to things arising on the basis of causes and conditions, but they think it proves their inherent existence, not negates it. So again, this is the realization of dependent origination at the most profound level. Because it is so difficult to understand, Venerable Randawa says, one must study the Madhyamika text over a long period of time before its full meaning can be grasped. And this is really getting at what we need to do. We need to continually investigate these teachings. I know it's hard getting our head around it, and some people don't have the ability to sit through teachings even, and to hear all of this because it's hard stuff, this is essential though. This is what we need to realize. It says here, the procedure for meditating with proper mental attention is first to make a thorough analysis of entities by means of the wisdom acquired from listening and contemplation. Those are the first two wisdoms that we often talk about. Listening is what you're doing now by hearing me go blah, blah, blah about emptiness. And then, of course, any reading that you do and so on. That's like bringing that information in. And it already becomes some level of wisdom because it introduces you to the way things actually exist. Second would be the wisdom arising from contemplation, which is by thinking about these teachings, which you're doing to some extent now, but it's good to meditate on the cushion and to actually, think about them and see if you can come to the same conclusions. And then eventually you develop the wisdom that arises from meditation, where we have a deeper realization of emptiness. So it says here, by means of those wisdoms, so as to determine that their nature is one of dependent origination, free from all extremes of conceptual over-elaboration, meaning free from what our ignorance does, which is elaborate things as existing inherently or existing not at all. Again, those two extremes. One should thereupon meditate upon this understanding through giving it repeated consideration. Again, that's that third level of wisdom that we gain after we've understood emptiness correctly. So now we have a scripture, another sutra, the Yukti Sastika states that those whose minds transcend and remain not in the extremes of existence, meaning inherent existence, and non-existence, meaning things don't exist at all, nihilism, are meditating upon the profound meaning of conditionality and non-conception. Trying to arrive at that non-conceptual awareness of emptiness that is the meaning of dependent arising, dependent origination. So then Venerable Randawa says, thus, meditation which consists of merely obstructing the conceptual processes or adhering to an extreme view concerning existence or non-existence, meditation lacking in the wisdom that seeks to determine the nature of dependent origination, is not true meditation on emptiness, he means, right? So again, if we don't have that, if we're falling into one of those extremes, if we don't have this wisdom that is really discerning the true nature of dependent origination being emptiness, that's not true meditation on emptiness. On the other hand, meditation that is sustained by a wisdom which seeks out the meaning of dependent origination, as described above, is proper attention of the mind and constitutes practicing prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom. So it goes back to the verse, right, where we saw proper attention of the mind. To get to this highest meaning through proper attention of the mind, putting mind's attention on the reasonings that we learned, the reasoning of the lack of production by the four extremes, the reasoning of dependent arising, other reasonings that are taught, we can get to that proper attention, knowing how things actually exist, that they lack any inherent existence and are dependent upon the variety of factors that give rise to them. Again, all things that are produced have their causes and conditions that they depend upon. All things that exist have their parts that they depend upon for that whole to be designated. And all things in the end depend upon mere designation, mere conceptuality, designating this seed, this sprout, and so on, all the various things that exist. So let me stop here and see if there are any questions, because we are ending this section on emptiness. It didn't take as long as I thought it might, but still considerable. Been on this for almost an hour, so any questions? I know this is tough stuff, and I've said that before, and I realize I don't want to make it sound harder than it is either, though, because it's interesting. I've heard these comments from people. Of course, I don't have any realization of emptiness at this level. But I've heard this comments in Buddhist circles sometimes. They said, when you finally get to that place of realizing it, you can't believe that you were blind to it for so long, kind of. It becomes almost like overly obvious. But I don't want to make it seem like, again, it's that easy to realize either, because all of these reasonings are to help us to get to this place where we see that this discrete, kind of concrete way of looking at the world around us in blocks of these various things existing, that this isn't the way things exist at all. They still can be designated. Oh, there's chair and there's table and what have you. But there's this vast web of interdependence going on that we are blind to. And we think that we're going to isolate out ourselves as separate from others and then make decisions on the basis of defending this thing that we think has some independent existence. But we see that the self only exists in relation to others and only exists in a very dependent manner and doesn't have that established kind of autonomy. And this belief in things being kind of on their own, autonomous, is part of this misconception. We have to get rid of all of that and see that things actually are in this, again, vast web of interconnectedness. So I don't know, that gives some clue. Yes, please, Sarah.
So let's assume we do realize the true nature of emptiness.
Uh-huh.
How does our behavior or our life differ in relation to the cups, the chairs, what we interact with? Does anything change
Does anything change?
in that sense?
Okay. So Sarah's question, if you didn't hear it online, was when you do have that direct realization of emptiness, how do things change? does our relationship with the world around us change and ourselves? Well, it utterly changes, they say, for the bodhisattva, or for that matter, anybody, because there are also those practicing the path to just mere liberation. But let's talk about the bodhisattva. They say when the bodhisattva realizes emptiness in this direct manner, which is this meditative experience, where emptiness is no longer a concept. It's not something we're thinking about. The experience of emptiness itself, this object that we can know, this truth, and the mind, they say they become like water poured into water. There's no longer a differentiation of subject and object because they're all of one taste. It's all emptiness. Emptiness, the mind knowing emptiness, and emptiness that is being known. It's undifferentiable. When you have that profound experience, they say you're in that for some period of time with this non-conceptual awareness. When you come out of it, your way that you look at everything around you, cups and tables and chairs and people and yourself, is completely altered. Because you know that things, first of all, don't exist in the false way that they appear. Remember, I mentioned that earlier. That's part of our problem. Everything appears to be real, existing from its own side, and it will do that when you come out of this meditation. But you know it doesn't exist that way. So you have no belief in these things existing on their own out there.
So how does that manifest in
Okay.
actual?
I'm getting there.
I thought you were done.
And so then when you talk about these objects that we start relating to, there's no room, because we're also thinking about the I. Whenever we turn our attention to the I, although it appears to inherently exist, we know it doesn't. You no longer can get invested in these things in the habitual ways that we do. You won't have attachment to the cups and the food and the people and the things that you were normally trying to get to protect this I and boost up this I and please this I, because you know that the I doesn't exist this way, and you know that people and other things don't exist this way. It's like you've disempowered yourself entirely from the normal way that we are relating to things in our world that causes attachment to arise, that causes aversion to arise, jealousy, pride, all these various things arise on these misconceptions. There's no longer, they say, even after that very first realization, there's no ground for that to happen. And especially because this strong sense of an I, around which all of these interrelationships happen, of I want this to satisfy my I want this to out of my life so I can protect my I, and so on. There's no basis for that to occur anymore. Well, you'll still eat food, you'll still, go to the bathroom, you'll still take a shower or do whatever the normal things that you do. You just you've disempowered the mechanism by which you would believe in those things and generate afflictions towards them. And then, of course, the karma that you would generate on the basis of that no longer arises because you're disempowered from it. Let me give another analogy that gives some idea. I mean, again, the Buddha used the analogy of a dream frequently. And I only know my own dreams. I don't know anyone else's dreams, but I assume you dream like I do. I was in really deep dream. I think was it last night or the night before, where I wanted to remember it because it was really kind of involved, but I completely lost the plot when I woke up. When you're in your dream state, everything is appearing as real as your waking state, right? If you're just getting caught up in your dream, and that's why we often have a lot of emotion even when we waken from a dream. You can have nightmares, right, that are really terrifying. You wake up with great fear and trembling. You can have desirous dreams where all sorts of delightful, wonderful things are happening, and you're like sad that you're waking up because you were really attached and happy to be there and experiencing these things. Your dream state is one where you have a belief in an imagined reality that is part of what our dream consciousness does. It brings up all these various things that seem to be real, and we buy into them. You have a similar kind of thing as what we have in the way ignorance is operating. You have a false appearance and a belief in that. Now, if you were to be, and maybe some of you have had moments, or maybe even longer times, I've only had moments of what I'd call lucid dreaming, right? Where you're actually aware that you're dreaming. Where suddenly, actually, it was one of the guys who came to one of the retreats, Paul Mark, way back when we were going to the Mandala Center. He talked about, he heard that if in a dream you can remember to look down at your hands, that actually sometimes induces lucid dreaming. But if you become aware that you are dreaming these objects, Well, then even though they appear, even though this delicious, delightful things or this frightening, terrifying thing appears, you have no conviction in it, right? Because you've seen it as a dream object. You've seen it to exist differently than the way it appears. You know it doesn't have that level of reality. I think the Buddha used a dream because it's really quite, comparable. It's not identical. Because actually it is said that in our waking state, of course, we still do create karma because we are harming beings through our actions and so on. I mean, even though it's just merely designated, merely imputed harm, it's still harm. And we do have karmic effects of what we do in our daily life, unlike our dream state, where the karma we produce in a dream is very weak because it's just mental movement. There's no real beings in our dream. It's only our imagination, our dream state. So what I'm getting at with this analogy is if you think about what it would be like to be in your dream, completely lucid, completely aware that you were dreaming. Well, then when these things appeared to you, something really threatening, you wouldn't have that fear arising. Why? Because you know that it doesn't exist in the way that it appears. Again, does that mean that the bodhisattva who realizes emptiness directly, that they're not going to run away from a tiger that's chasing them? I know they probably will, out of just some not wanting the tiger to, have that karma perhaps of eating them or whatever. Well, maybe they're in a generous mood and they want to give their body to the tiger. Who knows? I mean, who am I to tell what a bodhisattva would do at that point? But the idea is that in general, they are no longer working from this vantage point of me believing I'm real and I need to defend this real I and protect this real I and get what this real I wants. And then all of these things having a real nature that are part of this interplay of pushing things away, pulling things towards me. All of that push and pull and everything is not going to happen because they see it in the same way that someone who is lucidly dreaming sees their dream objects. So it's quite empowering, to be in this state, to be able to look at the world around you through the lens of emptiness and understanding it that way. So we cease getting kind of invested in all of these appearances because we see that that's how they are. God bless you. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, so can I
Mhm.
imagine that a person who has a true realization of emptiness,
Uh-huh.
their car gets hit in the parking lot, they don't care, there's no attachment to it. Things drop and break. They have no emotional reaction or destroy. The dog tears up their favorite slippers. There's no emotional reaction.
Yeah.
Is that what it would be like? They would,
think
I mean,
so.
that you would eventually live in a state of total shabbiness. Wouldn't you? Everything would kind of, the chairs would fall apart and you'd sit on the floor. Oh, well, it would be total, you'd be totally blasé about all the physical.
I don't want to make it sound like it's that blasé per se. What Sarah's question was, does this mean that you become so disengaged from reality that you're not even tending to things? I think you still do those things and you attend to them, but you don't have the investment in them that we have. Like when our favorite coffee mug or tea mug or whatever falls and breaks into 1,000 pieces, there's this like, my cup, right? Because it's my cup.
Yeah.
If this was sitting in the store and you hadn't even bought it and it fell off the shelf because somebody knocked it off and it fell into 1,000 pieces, you'd be like, oh, the guy's got to deal with cleaning that up and, the loss of merchandise, can write it off on his taxes or whatever. We wouldn't have any emotional attachment, right? But again, when you're in that state, I'm imagining, again, I don't have that realization. Imagine that you still do tend to things, but you just aren't that invested in it. So again, the dog tears up your slippers. It doesn't mean that you walk around in torn up slippers for the rest of your life. You still would go out and buy new slippers, but you don't have this attachment that gets upset when the dog tears them up and you go, oh, those are my favorite
So it'd be
slippers.
kind of a non-materialistic person.
Non-materialistic, but it's even beyond that, though. I think it's not just in regard to the materialistic things, because you can still have those things in your life. You don't get attached to them. You don't get attached to people. You don't get attached to thoughts, to feelings. You don't have any of that attachment because you're not you see that they don't have any real existence in that way. Now, again, the state of this is, it's hard for us to see it as being kind of blissful, but it's a state of non-attachment and non-hatred and non-ignorance. All these normal things that we have operating aren't present. There's a peace to the mind because we aren't all caught up in all of it. I mean, again, I still go back to the dream state and the lucid dreaming, thinking it describes most accurately what it's like. Because if you're in that dream state, aware that you're dreaming, then through the force of your dream consciousness, various things will appear, but you don't have that, again, investment in them. You're like, okay, well, that's interesting. It's kind of like watching a movie to some degree. Doesn't mean that you don't pay attention to the movie and what's going on in the world around you. And actually, that is something the bodhisattvas continue to do, is they're quite involved in the suffering of others and trying to address it. They're not totally ignoring all of that. When it comes to themselves and rotating around this strong sense of an I, though, they don't really have that. They're seeing things kind of like a movie or like a dream or, I don't know, like an illusion. It's hard for us to get our head around it completely, but if we really understood how this ignorance was operating and could imagine what it would be like to be without that, then I think we'd have some idea. We have to get really clear about what this ignorance is. What do we mean by the real I? What do we mean by a real computer? We use these terms, right? Having inherent existence, independent existence even. We have to really taste that and see what that's like. What is it that we are believing in? I think it goes very, very deep. As Rinpoche says, it's almost as if things don't exist. I mean, we have to shave this right to the very little last bit that is all that's necessary for things to exist, which is just nominal existence. Anything more than that is fiction. We are living in a world of fiction, essentially, and we are believing in the fiction. You know, there's no, none of these things exist when we analyze them. We have to be able to pull it all the way down to that very, very thin layer, very subtle layer of how things actually exist, which again is merely through designation, merely through imputation. What again, but I don't have the realization, so I can't explain it to you any better than what I'm capable of through my own intellectual understanding, which even is quite limited, I have to admit. But nonetheless, this is the invitation, if you will, when we hear these teachings to like, okay, well, I'm curious about that. What does that mean? To sit down and really think it through. How do things appear to you? How does the I appear to you? Again, with the I, it does get a little tricky because we do have some coarser views of the I that we can adhere to as well. There's other forms of ignorance involving the I. But when it comes to other phenomena, we should be able to very clearly see, oh, well, this is how it appears. It appears like my hand has its own handness established out here on its own. And I kind of believe in that having handness from its own side. This is why again, we even think that although I agree, I call it a hand, it must have some handness for me to call it a hand. Well, no. These are, again, what we decide on the basis of what we decide are hands and functions of hands and so on. And then we give it the label of hand. All these things lack any of that way of existing. So we have to get it has to become more tasty for us, if you will, rather than just an intellectual exercise. And that's the challenge that we all face, myself included, is to really make that wisdom our own through our own investigation. And it requires repeated meditations. As was said, first we listen to teachings on it, we read about emptiness, read all the things that we can get our hands on. Of course, one of the problems is in English. A lot of the terminology is different from book to book, depending upon the translator. But we try to get a correct understanding of emptiness through that. Then we think about it, contemplate it, which is what our meditation usually is now, is just kind of going through the process of investigating these teachings. And then eventually through the third level, when our meditation is quite profound and stable, then we can develop this deeper awareness. We have to be kind of interested in it. We have to have our interest piqued by these teachings, kind of wanting to go, well, what does that really mean? What is that like? These are good questions. I mean, I'm explaining them on the basis of my learning, but I don't have any real concrete experience of that. I think if we even had just a taste of it conceptually, where we started to see that strong sense of an I fall away, it can be quite profound. I think I've had moments that are close to that, where suddenly, you kind of have it, oh, wow, little glimpse of it, just a glimpse. Can't sustain it. It's not strong enough to be sustained, but it gives you a glimpse of what it's like when some of that drops away. Sometimes it can even happen when somebody's kind of in your face. Sometimes our gurus, a guru or a teacher can kind of get at you, in ways that, are quite skillful and make you kind of see, oh, there's that strong I arising. What is it like to kind of let that go? I don't know. Any other questions on this topic before we kind of move on? There's more to be seen on emptiness. Don't think that we've completely left it behind. But this is the longest section pertaining to it. Anyone? Okay. All right. Then let's carry on with the text. Oh, wait. We do have a question there. Eloise or Adrian? Adrian. Hi.
I don't know if I really have a question, but I'm just really fascinated by this teaching. I really am. And I love the teaching on emptiness, and I always have, but this one has I don't know what it is about this one and the way you've broken it down for us, but funny about the word emptiness, it almost has this, you get the idea that even though I've heard over and over and over that it's not really empty, it's not nothing, you still get the idea when you hear the word void and empty that it is nothing, right? And so it's really hard to wrap your mind around the teaching, when you start talking about how it is also, what it really is dependent arising. And so, and hearing it in this way, it's kind of the first time I think that I've gone, oh,
Yeah.
oh,
Okay.
I think I mean, it's just a glimpse. It's
Yeah.
just a glimpse, but it's starting to make sense enough that maybe I might try harder to get a grasp on it.
That's excellent.
You know,
That's excellent. Yeah. No, thank you for
um,
sharing that, Adrian. Yeah.
yeah. It's almost like things, if the word empty, if it's things are empty of themselves.
In a sense,
Is
I mean, it is a
that
self
sense?
in that they lack their own identity. So again, when I hold up
Right,
a bell ringer,
right.
it doesn't have its own identity established out here, which is again, as soon as I pull it up here, you sort of see that, like it appears to you as if it's established out here on its own as bell ringer. Because we got to, what they say happened initially was that we learned the label when this kind of basis appeared to us. But it's right after we learn the label, it's like the label absorbs into the basis here, and it becomes like self-existent in appearance, seeming like it has its own bell ringerness, if you can use that word. And that is what it is empty of, not having its own identity. I mean, it has an
And that's
identity, but we again establish
yes.
it conceptually. It doesn't have
Like,
any identity from its own side. So in a way, yes, it is empty of itself in terms of self, meaning its own identity established out here.
and that's easier to understand than once you get into the I, like you said. Then
I
it starts
think,
getting
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's oftentimes they say that we start with the I because it's perhaps a little easier to get how the I is imputed to some degree, but I still think it's really complex with the I, with this strong sense of self that we have at the center of the whole thing. But that is also the best place to start because that's what everything is revolving around. I wouldn't get involved in bell ringers and, ice cream and all the various things in the world unless I was in this place of this strong sense of I that grasps at those things, wants them, and wants to push other things away. Again, once you disempower that belief in this real I that is here, then there's no foundation for all these other afflictions to arise. But it is a little subtler. But I say that's why it's easier to see that it is this merely imputed thing, is because we can, to some degree, see that it depends upon body and mind, especially body. Like we identify people by bodies, right? I mean, here, like as I see people come on, of course, the names are in the little corner for Zoom too. But I can see, there's Adrian and there's Emily, and so or Eloise, sorry, not Emily. I don't know why I said Emily. I gave you a false designation. You know, there, so we have, again, we depend often on the bodies to identify people. But that already does show some measure of dependence, because we can't say there is this person without something arising before that that helps us to identify that as that person. So we do see, they say that the sense of a person or an I, we can kind of get that there's a dependent relationship in terms of things being kind of having something else that they depend upon for their existence. Without the body, there couldn't be an I, right? If, you know, I'm not in the screen, then how is Don in the screen? If the body's not in the screen, then Don isn't in the screen. So we kind of get this interdependence of those two things a little bit easier with the person to some degree. But I don't know. I mean, it's still very difficult. Don't get me wrong. Well, good. I'm glad that that had some enticement to it, and that you're interested in wanting to taste more. So that's good. Yeah, Jana. Thank you, Adrian.
I was just gonna add on to Adrian's curiosity about something that had helped me with that is if you look at items from another culture
Mhm.
that don't start screaming, this is a mug, this is a clock, because you've never seen it before.
Right.
That curiosity, for me, it helps me be able to work with that, because the item isn't screaming to me what it is.
Right.
I don't know what
right.
it is.
I
And
understand.
so it's
Yeah.
like, oh.
Yeah. So if you didn't hear what Jana was saying, was like, if you work with items from another culture, what came to mind when you said that was, I remember going to, I think it was in Washington, D.C., where there was an exhibit of African art. And then art included, of course, you know, utilitarian objects and things. And you'd see something that they have in their culture that you kind of be looking at and going, what is that? And you have to read the little thing to understand what that tool was created for or whatever.
Exactly.
So there is something that happens to us when we see things from that vantage point of not knowing what it is. Remember, there used to be a show, it was kind of like To Tell the Truth, where somebody would come in with an object and they would say what it is. Three different people would say what this object
Yeah.
does. And then they'd have to guess which one is giving the right explanation.
It's
But
perfect.
you know, but that does get us into a more quizzical mode about things. But even in the cases of like the museum, where you see the little thing and you read it and then you go, oh, that's what it is. And it kind of becomes that in a sense. You can see it almost happening instantaneously. But you know, we still do have new objects in our culture every now and then, but they get assimilated so quickly. You know, like iPads. You know, remember when the iPad was introduced? You know, there wasn't this phenomenon that we now take for granted and that we all have and use our, you know, finger and stylus or whatever to go around on the screen and pull up all this information and everything. You know, so you can see how quickly things go from just this nondescript sort of basis that we don't have a label for yet, and then it becomes what we label it as.
Yeah.
And appears to be that from its own
Very
side.
fixed.
Yeah,
Like
very
it's only
fixed.
this
Yeah.
thing.
I mean, another example I point out, and we are going to have to wrap things up. We've already gotten to the end of our time, but we'll start with the next section next week, which gets away from emptiness. The example I often use is from The Gods Must Be Crazy, the very beginning of that film, where these pilots are flying over the Kalahari Desert, and one of them finishes drinking his bottle of Coca-Cola, and he flings the bottle out the plane, and it comes whooshing down, and it lands in the desert, the Kalahari Desert, and it's seen by this bushman of the Kalahari, and he goes over there and pokes it a little bit. He doesn't know what it is, you know, and of course the audience is like going, what's he doing? It's just a Coca-Cola bottle, right? Because we are so fixed in our view of it being a Coca-Cola bottle.
Just from the shape.
Right,
We
they're just
know
from
it.
the shape. You don't even
Yeah.
have to see the words Coca-Cola, right? And he, of course, takes it and he takes it back to his tribe, his fellow bush people, and they start doing all these things with it, like using it to smooth out snake skins and pounding with the one at the bottom of it. They pound grain, you know, on like a mortar and pestle, you know, kind of thing. And then, you know, what else do they use it for? I think they even use it to blow into it and make music and whatever. So they have all these things. And of course, they think it's a gift from the gods because it came out of the heaven and landed in their backyard. But the problem was he only gave them one. And so there, it becomes a source of delusion for them. They get attached to it and they don't want others to share it, and they start hitting each other with it and everything, and it becomes this. And anyway, the idea is that we see how if we go in a sense with kind of a view that it isn't what we've already learned it to be and what it appears to us now as being, if you have those encounters with things, there is a wide range of possibility then before we've narrowed it down to, oh, but it's this. And then once it becomes this, then it becomes solid. And we believe in it from, the depths of our heart, that it has that identity from its own side. Anyway, I like sharing that one because if you get a chance, you can watch, I think the clip is on YouTube and you can watch the very beginning. The rest of the film gets kind of wonky and becomes really comedy and what have you, and it's a little different, but that whole part is really about emptiness. It's about how, again, things don't have that identity. Otherwise, everybody would see it as Coca-Cola bottle. The Bushman of the Colorado would say, oh, somebody dropped a Coca-Cola bottle. They're littering on us again, wouldn't see it as this gift from the gods. But it doesn't have that identity from its own side. It can be whatever beings conventionally agree upon. In terms of the Bush people of the Kalahari, that's what they agreed upon. It was going to be this gift from the gods and da. For them, it's very real as that, even though we look at it in the audience and go, it's just a Coca-Cola bottle,
With the limited view of what it can do.
Exactly. Right. It's there to contain Coca-Cola and, yeah, very limited view of the possibilities of it, the functions of it. Because again, all of that's determined by our minds as well, the functions of things. Okay. All right. I hope I've piqued people's interest in emptiness by doing another evening on it in a sense, because we did start it last time. But again, this is something that we should be curious about all the time, is trying to understand it deeper, more deeply each time, going into it, trying to gain an appreciation for what the ramifications of this really are. If it's what unravels the whole thing, well, then it's going to, by knowledge of it, we are going to be able to be free of the mind of craving and desire, be free of the mind of anger and so on. All these things, there won't be the ground for them to arise because we don't believe in things that way at all. And of course, eventually you get to a place where you don't even have to fight that belief or overcome that belief because you annihilate it, you eliminate it, you eschew it, as our text is saying. You have actually, gotten rid of it from the root. And then you won't have those concepts ever arising again. You'll still have the stains that give rise to this false appearance, but you won't have any even inkling of believing in it. And that's the last thing that you removed to become a Buddha. All right, so let's conclude for tonight. I will have to start clipping through these verses a little quicker in the future, but this is really, again, an exceptional section that was quite long. So I appreciate you all kind of bearing with me going through it with Venerable Rendawa's text. I think the ones coming up are actually much, much easier to work with. So let's go ahead and do the prayers, and we want to do the dedication list first. I'm sorry. So let's go ahead and do this. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Stop share. And let's put Jana. Hold the camera there. And by the way, those at home, if you do have some additional dedications at the end of each of these categories, you can say them and we'll add the names to the list.
We dedicate the merits of this teaching to those experiencing obstacles, specifically Stella, Jana. Those experiencing illness, specifically Stella, John, Jana, Bill, Patty, Dawn, and Mary Jo. And we also dedicate for those who have died in the last 49 days, specifically Ian Hobner, Mummy Max, and Alice Frank.
And any others for any of those categories at home? Mary
I'd like
Jo?
to dedicate for obstacles for Bill and Patty.
Okay. So obstacles for Bill and Patty. Mary Jo, did you have something you wanted to add? You need to unmute. Then we'll get to what you. Thelma for healing. Tegan says Ben Anderson for illness. Yeah.
For illness is a woman named Barnett, and also Raven Chacon, who has a bad injury. Thank you.
Thanks, Virginia. And Virginia having passed, so that would be with the death list. And I might add Helen Ivanov, my aunt Helen. I had a second aunt who passed away just about 2 weeks ago. And then Alyssa and Laura can be added for obstacles. Okay. Thank you all for adding those to the list, and then we'll be dedicating for those beings as well as for all beings as we recite these prayers. So get those on the screen, and Jana can lead us in that.
General dedication prayer in English. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more.
And we'll do the prayer for His Holiness on this page and then go forward to the one for Asohita.
The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us and intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long.
And then for Rinpoche's swift return.
Peerless teacher and
Teacher
assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pradika Buddhas, victorious Losang Father and Sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss! Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels, and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples.
So can we dedicate for all those beings that were on the list, as well as any other beings in our heart. And then also dedicate that all beings might attain perfect happiness, complete freedom from suffering through what we've done here tonight. Thank you all for participating. I got to get the camera up a little bit. And I appreciate everyone being here tonight. And I'll look forward to seeing you again next week. So again, next week we'll start with verse number 28. If you're following along in the book, Geshe Sopa's book, I think this is a whole new chapter because there's that chapter on emptiness. Again, went up through that verse 27, verse 28. Yeah, it starts chapter 5, I believe, on page 133. So again, I'll probably cover that whole chapter, I would hope, in our next teaching, if I can manage to stay on those verses. So, all right, everyone, be well. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Don.
Hey, everyone.
Good night, Don.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Well, we